the last time he was with us. I can't remember when that was, Stephen, about a year ago or maybe more. It was, I think at that point, we were actually almost hopeful that we might have averted Brexit altogether, but things, it was before the 2019 election anyway, I think, when we last had it. So maybe, and your great book, which I've been enjoying, I must say, it's teaching me at schools in Scotland in my time. There you are, Nation to Nation. Right. There's a good plug for you. I must say, in my time, we didn't do Scottish history. Although I was schooled in Scotland all my career, we did English history, or British history, I suppose it was a bit. And so I've been fascinated by the historic part, way back pre-1707 and all that. Very interesting, fascinating. But also your chapter on Europe is really, very, very good. I recommend it to anybody who can get hold of a copy. It's readily available on Amazon, and Mr. and Mrs. Topping in St Andrews have it stock, I think. So, Stephen, tell us what you'd like to get over to us at this point. It's a very interesting point. Here we are, just a month away from what could be quite an important date.
Yeah, well, look, John, what I thought I'd do is, the whole idea behind the book actually is to start a conversation. So what I thought I'd do, start a conversation about Scotland's foreign policy footprint. So I'm just going to, what I thought I'd do, and I'm even going to try and time myself, was I thought I'd give, say, 5 to 10 minutes of just an overview of why I've written the book, my research purposes, what it tells me. And then if anybody's got any questions for me, because what I've put in the book, as John, you've alluded to, are some significant questions that need to be answered regardless of what happens in Scotland, in Scotland's journey over the next few years. And the reason I've written about Scotland's foreign policy is that Scotland has a very significant foreign policy, has done for centuries. That's accelerated in recent years under the Conservatives in the Scotland office in the 90s, under the Labour Liberal administration in the first 2 terms of the Scottish Parliament, and of course under the SNP administration as well. But our foreign policy is one that's very much, in my opinion, hidden in plain sight. And yet it's one that has a huge impact on our domestic politics and therefore our day-to-day lives. So when I wrote the book, the first thing I did was I made the observation about history. Scotland has a very strong international brand. It has a distinctive set of policies. You're seeing an increasing divergence in foreign policy between Westminster and Holyrood. And this isn't something that's new. If you go right back to the mists of time, the one letter that we have in the name of William Wallace, the one letter we know he wrote was, of course, the letter of Lubeck, which was one of the first things he did when Scotland re-established its independence way back in 1296, was he wrote to the Hanseatic League, the EU of its day, to say Scotland's open for business. Robert the Bruce, his declaration of independence, if you like, was the Declaration of Arbroath, which was a letter to the Pope, which was considered by some historians who've compared it to be the United Nations of its day, if you like. And then the Union came into being and independence came to an end in 1707 as a direct consequence of, in part, not entirely, but in significant part, because of the Darien scheme, a failed Scottish foreign policy venture to establish a colony. So although that's in the dim and distant past, I thought it's really interesting that our politics have been driven by how we perceive international affairs through the short history of a devolved Scottish Parliament. The Iraq War, for example, has had a very significant impact on Scottish politics, as did Kosovo. And now, of course, our current constitutional debates in Scotland are being driven, rightly or wrongly, being driven by the UK's decision to leave the EU and how Scotland perceives its relationship with those in these islands and in the rest of Europe as well. So when I undertook the book, what I did was, as well as the basic research around it and drawing on my own experiences, I conducted about 50 or 60 interviews with colleagues from across the political spectrum. So I spoke to former Conservative ministers, I spoke to both surviving former Labour First Ministers and a wide range of others, on the record and off the record. I spoke to parliamentarians across Europe. as well as North America, senior members of the Biden administration, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the European Parliament, former cabinet ministers, diplomats, academics, journalists, and other stakeholders to try and get as wide a view as I possibly could. If you like, I've looked at Scotland's foreign policy, past, present, and future. The past, as I've intimated, where we've had an impact on the world, right up until the present day. And also in the past, you've got the diaspora, and that's spread in the fact that not only has international affairs had a big impact on our politics in Scotland, but Scots have had a big impact on the rest of the world as well. I look at present, how we interact as a sub-state actor, some of our work in Europe, some of our work further afield. I look at where the Scottish Government could, within its limited powers, try and re-establish its relationship with the rest of Europe and build its international profile. And interestingly, some of that is reflected in the SNP manifesto published today, and I understand that others may reflect that as well in the coming days. I also looked at other sub-state actors. So Scotland's got this unusual relationship with the UK. We don't have institutional mechanisms, which has been part of the problem in recent years with the Brexit impasse. If you look at Denmark, the way that, if you like, its sub-state actors in the Faroe Islands and Greenland, in Belgium with Flanders and with Bavaria and Germany and with Quebec and Canada, and often the foreign ministries, be it in Copenhagen or in Berlin or in Brussels or in Ottawa, set out very clearly where sub-state actors can act, and they work in very close collaboration on foreign policy with the central actor, which is something that doesn't happen in the UK. In terms of the future, I look at what's happened in terms of the divergence between Holyrood and Westminster. So in Holyrood, you have broad political consensus around areas like pro-immigration, refugees welcome, investment in international development, a focus on climate change and climate justice. And these tend to be, and I make the point that this is cross-party, whereas at Westminster, you're increasingly seeing a divergence to cuts in international development, to a more conservative approach to migration, and of course, the enormous elephant in the room, our relationship with the rest of the European Union as well. So I have a number of challenges that I set out. For those who believe in the Union, my challenge would be, as a direct consequence of Brexit, I think, but John Curtis seems to agree, you're increasingly seeing people who voted no previously shift to supporting independence. You now have to be in your 60s before you're in a demographic that comfortably supports the Union. So you have generations who have switched off the UK. So if the UK is to survive, it needs to find a way of switching those generations back on again. And for me, an awful lot of that is about the way that we see ourselves in the world and the way younger people who've just lost their European citizenship see themselves and see their place in the world as well. So very big, significant questions for people who believe in the Union over the next few years. Similarly, there are very significant questions for those who believe in independence. I'm one of them. Areas like, in some ways, Brexit has made independence for a lot of people more appealing, but it's also in some ways made it more difficult. What happens with the border? What happens with relations with the rest of the UK, for example? And also, and I'll finish on this point, what kind of country does Scotland see itself in the next few years? And Malcolm Chalmers, who's Professor Malcolm Chalmers, Deputy Director at RUSI, who's a unionist, and he said to me a really good point. He said, Stephen, we need to have this debate. I'm a unionist. I hope that Scotland votes to remain in the Union, but I hope that union changes. If Scotland does go down the route of independence, what does an independent Scotland look like? What are its values? Where does it place itself in the world? But similarly, if Scotland remains in the Union, how does it interact? How does it have that international branding, but remain part of the Union? And as we agreed, whether or not you're in favour of independence or not, our relationship with our neighbours and our international affairs sit at the very heart of our domestic debate in Scotland and are the determining factor in what happens next over the next 10 years. And that's one of the reasons why I've written this book, to try and open up that debate. And just a final point, don't be too hard on me, but for me, even if people merely say, Stephen, what you've written is a load of nonsense, I disagree, at least we're engaging with the debate and we're actually thinking about where we sit. And for me, that's the value of having this discussion at the moment. Thanks, John, and thanks for having me along tonight.
Unmuting myself. Thank you, Stephen. That's great. I'd just like to mention to you all that a good friend of mine, Simon Barrow, has just joined us. Simon and I, how many 100 years ago thereabouts, we did our national service together in the Scots Guards, and we have an ongoing interchange every now and then about Scotland. He's a very lovely Scottish wife, and although he lives in Suffolk, and by Scotland and Europe in particular, where we agree 99.9% on everything, I think. So anyway, he's joined us. So I'm delighted to have you, Simon, here. Welcome.
John, thank you so much. This brings back memories of the late Shirley Williams. I was on the advisory council of the European movement, 89 to 92. And those were great days. And I just wish that the hope and the emotion of Europe, which moved all of us, including the two best known people, Roy Jenkins and Geoffrey Howe, as well as the head of, I think, BP, were an extraordinary time, and how the biggest issue was how to get Tony Blair, who we knew was a positive thinker on the European cause, how to get him to use his remarkable abilities as a communicator and a rising star to come firmly onto our side from the emotional point of view as well as the logical point of view. We lost the vote, in my view, because we failed to play the real thing that moves me. It's not the money. It's the idea of being part of after 2,000 years of warfare and jealousy, something that is in the modern world. And that continues to move me. And I just hope that one way we'll be back there. And of course, I'm very split. I'm a unionist, but I totally understand the wish of pro-European Scots to get the hell out of here and move in with Europe if the financial aspects can be settled, which I know is a major issue. Anyway, that's where I come from. Thank you very much, John.
Great, Steve. Simon, it's good to have you on with us. Stephen, we'll come to questions, but I was particularly, let's say, take this scenario that we actually do stay in the Union and you want to get Scotland to assert its internationalism more. You mentioned you do in the book quite a lot about the Faroes and Greenland and so on. I remember when I joined the European Parliament in '79, we had a member from Greenland. It took him nearly 2 weeks to get to and from the Parliament, I think, as I recall, because of all the ferries and things. In those days, there weren't that many airplanes. Then, of course, they decided they were going to leave. But yeah, he was an Eskimo, literally, and he came all the way from Greenland to Brussels for our meetings. Anyway, I mean, do you think one of the problems I've been seeing just recently in our relationship with London is this lack of respect for Scotland's political politics, and I'm not a Scottish nationalist, but I still reckon that my parliament in Edinburgh should be respected, and the government it elects should be respected, and that's what I worry. But do you think there's any possibility of achieving something within the Union that is satisfying for the people of Scotland that would actually, obviate the need for independence?
So, John, it's a really good question, and we've seen a couple of interesting papers coming out this week by people like Philip Rycroft, who I spoke to for the book actually, and was it Kieran Martin, I think, is a former official, who brought out an excellent paper this week as well. I mean, Brexit changes things unless Scotland can rejoin the EU in some way. Look, so in my opinion, in the short term, I think for many people, and this is reflected in data and the polling, the independence ship has sailed, and I'm not sure how Scotland can fit in. That being said, let me try and give the alternative view, which I don't happen to agree with, but I've tried to reflect in the paper. John, I think you hit on a really interesting point, which is, and I'm going to make an observation which you can say is fair or unfair. I can remember when I was in Parliament, I was finding that there were, even though everybody in the Conservative Party and everybody in government would describe themselves as a unionist, I found precious few proper unionists, people who, if you like, thought about the constituent parts of the UK and therefore thought about how the union operated. And sometimes people would talk about the union, but actually talked about Westminster and gave very little regard to the union itself. Now, there are ways that you can make it work, but I'm not sure there's a political will to do so. I think the Nordic states provide a really interesting example. So in the Nordic states, you have, for example, Finland sits inside the euro and inside the EU. Sweden and Denmark outside the euro, inside the EU. Norway outside the EU. You have sub-state actors within that with huge amounts of autonomy. So the Åland Islands, for example, which is part of Finland, voted independently to join the EU alongside Finland. But they could have opted, because they have a Sovereignty Act, they could have opted to have remained outside the EU but still be part of Finland. And actually what's interesting, they negotiated for all the chat that we had previously on duty free. If you get a ferry from the Åland Islands to any other part of the European Union, you can buy your duty free on the ferry from the Åland Islands to any other part of the European Union because of the deal that they negotiated. Similarly, and you referenced this, John, Greenland was part of the EU, but left the EU, but remains part of Denmark for the time being. And that's really interesting. And there was talk, I remember a few years ago, in sort of 2016, 2017, of the possibility of a reverse Greenland. And there was some really interesting Danish academic explored this who was at LSE. So what's really what I find fascinating about these sub-state actors in the Nordics is that you've got that sense of Nordic identity and Scandinavian identity, you have a national identity, and you have a more localized identity, and you have a European identity with different parts of the Nordic entities, for want of a better expression, fitting in their own way. There are other ways, and also within that, the Faroe Islands and Greenland have extensive foreign policy powers, and the Danish Foreign Ministry puts on its front page, here are the areas where we have power over foreign policy. Here are the areas where the Faroese and the Greenlandic authorities have power over foreign policy, and we work together. And what's really interesting is that if you're a Faroese official or a Greenland official, you get the same diplomatic status granted to you by the Foreign Ministry in Copenhagen as a Danish official. The same goes in Belgium, actually. There is no hierarchy between Belgium at the federal level, Flanders, Wallonie, and the Brussels region. In fact, the sub-state entities actually sit on the European Council, and Flanders, for example, leads exclusively on fisheries. So you see that where you have this enormous amount of decentralization, and it's not just in Europe. In Canada, when CETA was being negotiated, the Canadian authorities made the very clever, I think the very clever decision to include all of the Canadian states as part of the negotiating team, which meant that they all had a say. But actually, when you signed the thing off, and when you sign off any deal, there's stuff that you like more than you like other bits. That's the whole idea of a compromise in a deal. But those states, including Quebec, had ownership over it because they were sitting in the room. So they had to defend it at the same time as the federal level defended it. I think there's a significant political problem in the UK, which is this, and sorry, this is a long answer, but it's a really substantial question you're asking, John. Anand Menon, who's at UK in a Changing Europe, I was doing an event with him recently, and he said to me, and this is a political problem, he said, look, the Conservative coalition of voters who delivered that thumping majority in 2019 are made up of 82% Leave voters. And then the other 18% tend to be habitual Conservative voters. That is a cohesive and very successful political coalition that's put Boris Johnson where he is. But that coalition likes picking fights with Europe, it likes cutting international development, and it doesn't like devolution very much. So can you have this Conservative government with that political coalition and the union at the same time? And that's something which I know we'll all have different views on this call, but that is a very significant question that I suspect will be answered over the next 5 to 10 years.
Very good.
Tragedy.
Okay, any questions from other people who'd like to come in? Put up your hands on the screen, then you can. Paul, yes, Paul, come in, Paul.
I've always thought that the answer should have been a federal United Kingdom to answer basically what you just said there, Stephen. It's the only way around the way that you can keep the union together. And I've always found it interesting that when we set up our political system in Germany after the war, we picked a federal system. I've been told by a lot of my SNP friends that it's too late now for a federal alternative. Do you think if you were putting on an unbiased hat that you would think that the federal system would be an alternative to independence?
So, and I'm really trying my best here. So, the reason I talk about, and Paul, you know this, and everybody here knows this, we can have debate and discussion, but the one thing that never lies, it might change, but it doesn't lie, is when you look at the data. And sometimes when your political party is doing well, you sit and you study the data and you think, oh, the data is right. And other times when your political party or your political viewpoint's not doing so well, and I think this happened to me as a Remainer, you look at the data and it's not telling you the story you like, but are you taking a good hard look at it? Now, when we look at the data at the moment, what does it tell us? It tells us Remainers that are getting in behind independence just now, that younger people women in particular, are getting in behind independence. We know that much of this has been driven by Brexit and all that represents in terms of governance. We know that people care a lot less about the economy than they did in 2014. So any future independence referendum, if it were to be held, would be a very, very different set of circumstances. So if I were a unionist, I would stop trying to fight the 2013, 2014 referendum, because the mistake you always make in politics, and we've all made it in different political parties, is you try and fight the last election, because it's easy to fight the last election because you know how it turned out and you know what people are thinking. It takes imagination and a little bit of courage to fight the next election because you don't know how it's going to turn out. And sometimes you get that right, and sometimes more often than not, you don't. Now, I think federalism could have been an answer in 2013, 2014. I actually think there's a chance that if you get a sort of a government, I actually think I've spoken to Keir Starmer, sorry, all this is private, about this. I think there are people at Westminster who get the union, but the problem is the Conservative Party has lost a lot of its unionists, like proper union, people who think about this. And the Conservative Party has changed radically in the same way, and I saw Phillips O'Brien, who's a professor at the School of International Relations, has studied the change between the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States. That the Democrats failed because they were chasing the wrong voters. And in some ways, the Labour Party is doing the same at the moment. Things are changing. I can't see, given the Conservative successful coalition, I can't see anybody of any authority advocating federalism within the next 5 years, at least. And things are changing in the electorate so quickly and especially in those younger generations, that I'm not sure what the appeal would be, because if Brexit and our relationship with Europe is driving this, then within this, if Scotland is to remain within the UK, it would have to be allowed somehow to join the European Union, which is feasible if you devolve migration and business regulation and some other areas. But the political will has to be there. And I'm not sure the political will is there. And if you look at the generations, you know, something like 70% of 16 to 35-year-olds believe in independence now. It's a given with some generations, and then it goes up to about, I think it's 65% up until 45, and then it kind of starts to fall off a cliff. The big difference in terms, you know, is one of age, in terms of what you know, it's not geography, it's not educational attainment, it's not income, it's age. So I believe in independence, and I'm trying to answer this for you as positively as I can, because I know that people like you, Paul, think about this deeply and care about this and can see the problems. With this UK government, that successful electoral coalition, I think you need to get people adopting federalism very, very, very quickly if the union is to be saved, and I don't see any political will at the moment at all. And also, every time the UK government decides to get an uptick in the polls in England because it picks a fight with Brussels over something, you'll lose that little bit more support up in Scotland. Sorry, I don't mean to paint a dim view, and others will take a different view, and I know, and I've got a certain perspective. But I think if I were a unionist, I'd be looking at a tough job, not an impossible job by any means. You know, this is far from a foregone conclusion, but a difficult job nevertheless.
My follow-up question would be, if I can have one, is simply this. Do you think we'll need to go to a halfway house before we went into the EU? In other words, join a Norway model first?
So that's a big I don't know. I think that, I mean, we all know that the European Union, and we saw it in Cyprus, we saw it with East Germany, we're seeing it across the piece. The European Union finds political solutions to political problems all the time. Now, I think that, and Nicola Sturgeon was quite clear on this today, she takes the 2016 referendum as a mandate for renegotiating Scotland's re-entry into the EU. So she doesn't see a need, as the First Minister at the moment. We'll see what happens in a few weeks' time, but let's, you know, just for argument's sake. So given that political obstacle is removed by the prospective pro-independence First Minister, if you like, you could try and speed it up by having, let's say you've got a 2 to 3 year accession process from the UK, and then you have twin tracks into the EU. I think it's possible. We know the EU can turn these things around. Personally, I think, and from speaking to politicians around Europe, I think it's probable. But if there was a halfway house, you know, let's say you've not negotiated accession in time, I think your halfway house would only be for a year or two with a very clear direction of travel, because the EEA EFTA model is not one that is advocated by either the European Union or EFTA itself, you know, because they'd have to accept you as well, or Scotland at the moment. So I can't see there being, I think politically, the EU and Scotland, and I dare say the rest of the UK in terms of certainty, would want to see the future relationship stabilised as quickly as possible. That's not to say there aren't very significant challenges, and then that's why I've also written in the book where if the Scottish Government's serious about independence and about that timescale, then it needs to start work on accession now. Does that help? Yeah, thanks.
Anthony Lodge, did you have your hand up? No.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Sorry, then I'm Joe Goodburn next after you. You've got to unmute yourself. You're muted. You just muted yourself. Right. You're still. That's right.
Am I audible now?
Yes.
Good. Okay. is there a danger that the Conservatives themselves might be fighting the last election by constantly banging on about Brexit? Is the Brexit vote, which went the Tory way last time round, as solid in England as it was, and is it likely to persist over the next 2 or 3 years?
Well, I suppose the very short answer, Anthony, is a good question. The very short answer is we'll find out in about 4 weeks' time, when we've got what's been described as Super Thursday, with local authority elections in England, elections in Wales, elections in Scotland, and big elections in London. But that being said, the Conservatives have had a pretty consistent lead in the opinion polls, you know, about 8 points. As pollsters have said, that coalition is holding together down in England. And we'll also see, you know, there was one opinion poll in Hartlepool for that by-election, which takes place on the same day, which was at one of the, which had the highest Brexit Party vote, I understand, at the last election. So it seems to be holding together, that coalition. Now, we'll find out. But I also read something that's really interesting about this realignment of politics, which is just as the red wall, if you like, socially conservative Labour voters who were pro-leaving the EU seem to have switched to the Conservatives. Are there now what somebody described today was reading about blue wall seats? And I think it was places like Wickham and Chingford. So, you know, the sort of commuter belt seats around London. Are they now switching because their demographic is pro-European, slightly younger, and maybe would have voted or being switched off by Boris Johnson? And I remember speaking to an awful lot of English politicians about this, about the Brexit referendum. And I said, look, from chapping doors, and I can see other people who've gone around chapping doors on this call, we all know that for whatever political party you might belong to, there are polls, and then there's the feel that you get from chapping doors, which is not scientific, but you know, if you knock enough doors, you get a sense sometimes of what's going on that sometimes isn't picked up on. Now, what I said to them, and it was interesting because MPs from south of the border were picking up on this, the independence referendum changed things in Scotland. We take that as a matter of fact now, whereas in late 2014 it wasn't, or even 2015, it wasn't a matter of fact. And it now means that if you're pro-independence, you're pretty much voting SNP. If you're not pro-independence, you're not. And it doesn't matter if you think the Scottish government's doing a good job on health, education, or whatever it happens to be. People are voting on constitutional lines, and they're voting in accordance with their referendum vote from 2014, and for some people, 2016. People hold on to the referendum vote in a way that they do not hold on to their party political allegiance. And I wonder, and we already saw that in 2019, whereas you saw some seats, Labour got absolutely hammered, but was still picking up seats from the Conservatives in London, and losing a vast swathe of seats that it never expected to lose. And I wonder if you're going to start seeing a realignment of broader UK politics. But at the moment, it looks like Boris Johnson is holding together a very strong electoral coalition, which means that I think he's going to have a pretty decent result for a midterm government, incidentally, in a few weeks' time.
Thank you, Joe Goodburn.
Yes, thanks.
And Simon.
This is all really super interesting. I wanted to pick up a bit on Simon's point at the beginning about the emotion, because I do think I wasn't in Scotland for the first Indie Ref, but clearly from talking to friends and family, it was a very emotive issue, and it was very divisive, sadly, even among family, among good friends. And I have, a bit like Simon, two really emotional moments in my civil service European career. And I think the first one was at the time when Donald Dewar, wish that he was still here, flew up all the Scottish MPs to the castle and announced that devolution was going to go ahead. That was a moment, a wonderful moment. And then in 1999, when Vanessa and I had finished our proposal for Scotland House, and it all went through, and finally we got the okay from across the road in Uckrep that they would allow us to be diplomats, I basically became the first Scottish diplomat for almost 300 years, which was so exciting. And I really think that we all believed it would work, because the joint ministerial councils that were supposed to be set up, they sounded, when Vanessa and I were doing the research for Scotland House, we divided it between us, and my bits were to talk to all the Scottish MEPs, hence my knowledge of John. And then I went round as many of the sub-member state representations that I could that were in Brussels at the time. And it was almost, they were sort of incredulous that it was even going to be a question that the Scottish minister, now that we were having our own parliament, wouldn't get to sit at the front table in the council meeting room. For those who've not been in a council meeting room, there basically is an inner table where you have the minister plus his permanent representative and the most knowledgeable civil servant who's advising on the subject. So there's 3 seats. And among the German Länder, when it's a council that the Länder have the power to organize that topic in their own Länder themselves, then they take turns, and each Länder gets a turn about being the minister who will sit at the front table. And in Belgium, it works like that. And Spain's a bit complicated, but some of the Spanish comunidades autónomas have quite a lot of power, and they get to sit at the front table too. The Scottish Fisheries Minister never got to sit at the front table, which is just ridiculous. And when I was Lord Lindsay's PS, and we were back and forth to Brussels every week for Agriculture Council because of the BSE crisis, the only time he got to sit at the front table was when the English minister was so exhausted in the middle of the night that he had to go and lie down upstairs. So, you know, then it was okay for the Scottish minister to sit at the front table. And a lot of the time, you know, of course, there's a UK line negotiated, and it just seems so sort of petty that having set up this system of different parliaments within our country, they couldn't follow what other European countries do in terms of sharing that sort of responsibility. Then my other emotional moment, and I think this is so important, and this is what all the 82% who were so misinformed don't get, is there's a wonderful big park called the Parc Saint-Contenaire, very close to the European area of Brussels. And in 2004, when we had that magical moment when all those Eastern European countries joined Europe, that, you know, when I learned my geography, they'd all been in that big pink block over there. I didn't know their names. I didn't know anything about their cultures. And they all set up stalls all around the Parc Saint-Contenaire. And we learned about their gastronomy, their dance, their music. And it was wonderful. And, you know, if all those poor people who voted Conservative in the last election could just have understood even a little bit of that, it would have made that, what were you calling it, Conservative political coalition, so different. And so my kind of only hope that remains about them is that I think for many, many people, it was based on a complete, very cleverly constructed, huge amount of misinformation that actually has really been our history of being members of the EU. We've been fed misinformation really since we joined, which is very sad. So where can we take it from here? And why did the joint ministerial councils not work? Because there was no trust, because the political balance all changed. And one thing I'm slightly worried about, given what I've just said about misinformation or lack of information, is that I wish I was clearer, or I could be able to explain to my dad, who has been a Liberal all his life and is sort of pretty determined not to vote nationalist, Scottish nationalist, because he doesn't get the economics of how it'll work. And I'm just a bit worried that that's not only is how we would continue our relationship with the rest of the UK unclear, but not how are we going to become the Danish economy or the Irish economy? And that's really lacking, and that bothers me.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we need more clarity on that, good ideas about how we could work with Europe and the UK if that's what happens.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was rather a long intervention, but I was feeling very emotional about it all.
but it's very good, and I'm sorry I didn't get to speak to you, Joe, but I did get to speak to Vanessa when I put the book together, which was enormously helpful. But I'm sorry, I wish I could have included you as well.
Yeah, at the time, but anyway.
but on the rules, I mean, I think that so part of the problem is within the UK system is there are no rules. So it is just for the UK minister to say who sits. And I used to go to council meetings as well as a special advisor, and it just wouldn't happen. And actually, I'll say that Labour were as guilty as the Conservatives. And I can remember the day before the 2010 UK general election, Richard Locke, because I remember I was special advisor at the time, there was a big conference that the Spanish presidency had organised. And you know, you've got all those member states, you have elections all the time. So there's always a member state that you'll know this better than I do, that's got electoral time. So it wasn't there to trip up the UK. It was just that, you know, if you think about it, in the EU, there's a general election at least once every 3 months. If you think, you know, if it's every 4 or 5 years. So these things happen. Anyway, Richard Lockhead had offered, there was a big conference on the CFP and the Common Fisheries Policy. Richard Lockhead offered to go for the UK because it was the day before the UK election. He offered to agree speaking notes with the UK. And even under Labour, the UK said no. And it was only a discussion. It was only a conference. It wasn't deciding anything. It was an exchange of ideas. And the UK government said no. And they sent a member of the House of Lords to read out the speaking notes instead, who was responsible for agriculture, bees, environment. No disrespect to that particular minister, but no background on fisheries. So this wasn't just a Conservative thing, it was a Labour thing as well. It always depended on the personalities. So I remember Richard, I can't remember his name now, Richard, former DEFRA secretary, who was very good. There were certain DEFRA secretaries who were good, people like, I'm afraid to say, Owen Patterson, who were less good. But, you know, in a political system, it shouldn't depend on the personalities. And if the people of Scotland decide, you know, and I spoke to Henry McLeish, and Henry McLeish used to say to me, oh, it was fine in my day because I'd been an MP for 10 years before I was a minister in the Scottish executive, as was. So I'd just phone up my contacts. But, you know, phoning your mates only goes so far in terms of constitutional pressure valves. And if you look at the Länder in Germany, if you look at Belgium, the rules are very, very, very clearly set out. So even if two sets of politicians and two sets of different governments disagree with each other, and I'm afraid in a democracy that will always happen because different people, you know, get different electoral decisions are made, you have that challenge and that fundamental flaw within the, so that if you like, in Scotland we have devolution, but Westminster has never, there is no process at Westminster to take into account devolution. On the just learning, and I'm going to make this point, and I think we all as pro-Europeans, one of the lessons I learned, and I use it as an illustration. In northeast Fife, the area that I used to represent, and a lot of people here live in, the Westminster constituency takes in Leven and it takes in St Andrews. And I can remember during the EU referendum, and the two towns, by the way, are about the same size. But I can remember being in St Andrews and you'd have your street stall. You know, I'd be there with the SNP, and next to us, the Liberal Democrats would be there, and there'd be a few Green Party members, and we were all jollily chatting to everybody, and everybody was in agreement that wasn't the EU a marvellous thing. And then you go down to Leven, and I can remember we had to pool our stall because we realised we were whipping up resentment, and you'd stop and speak to people, and they'd say, you know, in places like Leven, not across, but there are parts of Leven where you get significant areas of unemployment, of poverty, and people would say, well, what's the EU ever done for us? And it became very difficult to answer that question. And actually, it became fundamentally difficult to answer that question 2 weeks before a referendum after 40 years of not talking about it. And that was a fundamental problem. And that was a political problem. I'm not blaming the civil servants or anybody else, but that was a political problem. And that's why where you see people voting along the lines of the referendum, I'm afraid to say I do not see a quick fix to this. You know, and I even remember in the referendum campaign, and I argued that the referendum shouldn't take, David Cameron wanted to get over and done with quickly. But I remember speaking to Conservative colleagues in the corridor saying, you cannot undo 40 years of bashing the EU in a 6-week election campaign. You just
Yeah.
can't.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's all ancient history, but I think there's a lesson for us all now. And I currently chair an organisation called EU and Me, which, you know, working alongside all the other organisations, we know we're in it for the long haul and about information and building a case. Finally, on economics, and I'm not an economist, Andrew Wilson did a lot of work for the Sustainable Growth Commission, which got a lot of pans when people read the headlines, but the guts of it are actually quite interesting. And Andrew Wilson's been very interesting on this. My observation is that Scotland, if Scotland becomes independent, it must do so in a spirit of generosity. And that means if Scotland becomes independent, it tries to rejoin the EU as quickly as possible. And actually, in my opinion, others may disagree, but in my opinion, just as Ireland has been the critical friend to the UK and has tried to keep the UK close to Europe, I think that England and Wales will find it very, very, very difficult to float off away from Europe when they're surrounded on 4 sides by the European Union. So it must be in a spirit of generosity. We must try and keep as much as we can in terms of relations across these islands. And actually, if you look at it, we share a language, we share a number of legal areas, transport, family, and other links. And that's where you've seen cohesion at a European level. And there's no reason why we can't have cohesion in a British Isles level, which is interestingly what we've seen across the Nordic states as well.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah.
So thank you, Stephen and Joe. Simon Barrow, Simon, your go.
Well, that was a wonderful thing to hear from Stephen just now. I'm an optimist. I think this coalition, as you call it, I think it is on the wrong track, and it will be seen off. I cannot imagine the total death of one nation conservatism of my childhood and over the centuries. I don't think that's. It looks like it's dead. It looks like the Conservative Party is a right-wing sect. It looks like the cabinet is also a one opinion cabinet. You can't be in there unless you fundamentally believe in the right-wing sect that is being created. It is not a one-nation country in their view. That cannot last. It cannot last because the cabinet itself does not, putting it mildly, it does not represent the finest intellects that we have in the British Isles. It will be seen off because so many of the brightest and best believed in Europe for commercial, opportunistic, and for their children reasons. And I think economically, clear away the effect of the pandemic and our recovery this summer, the hard choices that we were given back in 2016 will come home to roost. And I think it's a very odd coalition. Right-wing capitalists and right-wing red seats, as they were called. I can't see that working. And I think, therefore, that there is a chance. My concern is Scotland will go, and there's England in this ruinous government, which will lead us into, I don't know, a sort of Singapore towed out into the middle of the Atlantic. I mean, incredible right-wing opportunities, which some people in that field see as the way we will become richer. Well, some may do, but not the whole country. And I just cannot see it working. I wish we could, but I don't think equally we will see this government fail until we see the negative aspects of our decision of 2016. When that happens, there's a great many people who are keeping quiet. I'm, I suppose, one of them, although I'm speaking my mind tonight. That there are hundreds, thousands, millions of Remainers still there. And talk to anybody. I know nobody who has changed their mind. Nobody. And they're still around, they're still at work, and they're still determined to see the right solution. And I just wish that we could, nothing will happen to ruin the Union, the UK, until we've got a better government in Westminster. I just hope I'm right.
I think the matter is timing, isn't it? Then comes into the whole thing.
Yeah.
You know, as the Union, it's going to be 5, 10, 15 years, heaven knows. It's going to be 5 years, 3 or 4. Maybe Boris is going to have an election next year, possibly. He's talking about it, apparently. Having it while things are going well for him, he'll have another, so that gives him another 5 years. Whereas we, on May the 6th this year, have an election in Scotland. If Mr. Curtis and polls and all that are anything like right, it looks like essentially that is the referendum, the independence referendum. It seems to me, I'm not sure you even need an independence referendum, because if indeed there is this great majority for independence parties, you've actually decided it there and then. But so the timing could be, you know, way out. In fact, Scotland could be banging at Brussels' door in quite short order, whereas the UK, if your scenario was to happen, it's probably going to be a decade or more. What do you think, Stephen? Timing? Sorry, can I go back to Stephen and ask him what he thinks about the timing issue?
Timing, I think it's very difficult to say. I do think that what's said before elections and what's said after elections are two very distinctive things. So I think the key time will become immediately after this Scottish election. I actually suspect that the UK government is gearing up for a referendum at the moment. And so you could see some significant movement over the next little while. And I suppose my appeal would be to organisations like Fife for Europe is to, I don't think you have to do too much persuading of the Scottish government, certainly, is to keep Europe on the agenda and to keep it as high up as possible. And I know that some political parties, Labour, for example, and even to a certain extent the Liberal Democrats, and I worked really closely with them over the years, good pro-Europeans in both parties who still exist, is that I think sometimes they need a little bit of pressure kept on them in terms of maintaining that positivity towards Europe over the next few years as well.
And what about these issues like the financial, the economic, the currency, the border? Can those be overcome by the emotion?
Well, it's quite
the emotion.
It's quite interesting that increasingly there's polling now. Lots of people, and I would defer to the economists on this one, of which I'm not one. But a number of pro-independence economists, of course, would argue that Scotland would be better off, and others who are against independence would argue the other way. So I will leave that argument and debate to people who know much more about it than I do and who are more informed than I am. But the one thing I'll observe, again, looking at the data, is that increasingly people have decided that they don't care if they'll be better off or worse off, that they just want to be independent now. And interestingly, that was a driver on both sides of the EU debate as well, if there are lessons to be learned from the Brexit debate. So you need to have a more powerful message, I think, on both sides. The economy is incredibly important, really important, but it's not everything when people make decisions.
Yeah.
So, any other questions for anybody? Like to come in? Yes, Paul.
I see Larissa as well, I think.
Paul and Larissa, right? Paul first, and then Larissa.
Yeah. You mentioned, Stephen, that during your research for the book, you obviously spoke quite widely to people across the continental mainland. What is the feeling there in terms of the prospect of Scotland becoming independent and rejoining the EU? Obviously, the major problem that we hear about, or the possible problem, is the attitude of Spain. But what about the signal that came from Brussels concerning Erasmus? Because surely something could have been worked out there, but it seemed to have been stamped on. Or have I misunderstood it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, first of all, and I found this during my time in Parliament, when I go to other European parliaments and talk to them, people are really interested in what's going on in Scotland at the moment. Really interested. They are taking it seriously. They're paying close attention. That is not to say that they're taking a side. You know, I think people very much feel that Scotland's future is for the people who live and work in Scotland. But they're taking it very seriously. So there's a challenge for both sides in that regard. That I can remember one of the big mistakes that ministers would make in Whitehall during the Brexit years, which was they'd stand up in the chamber and say the most dreadful things about our European partners, and then they'd go to Europe, and then 3 hours later they'd be negotiating with people that they'd just been bad mouthing in the chamber, and they had to be reminded, you know, a lot of people speak English and they can also watch the telly. So I think there's a lesson there that although it is our debate and our decision, we're not doing this in a vacuum. So there's a huge amount of attention. Things have moved in terms of independence. I think, you know, nobody will intervene, but I think there's an expectation that Scotland may become independent, and so they're starting to think about what that means. The Spanish have been really interesting. Both Spanish foreign ministers under both Partido Popular and under the Socialists as well have both said, look, if Scotland goes down the route of independence and it's done democratically and legitimately, then we don't have a problem with it. And that's been quite interesting. And they've gone out of their way to say Scotland is not Catalonia. You know, we live in the United Kingdom, which is different from Spain, where that territorial cohesion is very important in Madrid. On the Erasmus question, it is a bit different, to be fair. I mean, the thing that I remind people who are pro-independence, who expect the EU to come over the hill in a white charger, is that the EU is loath and will not interfere in what are the internal issues of a state, be it a member state or another state. And the constitutional situation in Scotland is and remains an internal issue for the UK. So on Erasmus, to be fair to Ursula von der Leyen, she did say, look, we would happily consider other options, but the EU negotiates with states. It does not negotiate with bits of states. So, and I noticed there was something in the SNP manifesto today that they are thinking about it. And Mark Drakeford announced that they're trying to do something as well. But the EU negotiates with states rather than bits of states. So there needs to be
just coming there, but earlier, Stephen, you indicated that in many areas that's not the case. That you cited the Ireland Islands, for instance, which has its own identity, and presumably it could, if the situation were different, perhaps retain
yes,
when the rest of the country departed.
It is, but critically, the Åland Islands did not negotiate that with Brussels. The Åland Islands negotiated that with Helsinki.
Right.
So you see, so Helsinki was the bit that so because of its Sovereignty Act. So if Helsinki wasn't happy with that, then the EU wouldn't be happy with that. Now, that's not to say there's not stuff you can do. And one of the things, my challenge to the Scottish Government would be you'd need to staff up Scotland House enormously. And I'll say to Joe, who I can see, the amount of praise that I heard for the Scotland House model from senior European officials, the amount of praise about the hard work that's gone into it, the model being a good one. But I'll say this, Scotland House And so the model and the work that Joe and Vanessa and others did, and I worked at phenomenally good model. But, and here's a challenge for the Scottish government, that was a model that was built when Scotland was a part of an EU member state. Scotland is no longer a part of an EU member state. It is a part of a third country. And therefore, Scotland House, you know, the great irony of Brexit is that Brexit means more British bureaucrats in Brussels, because you need to staff up UPCREP, you need to staff up Scotland House. The Norwegians have their biggest representation on earth is in Brussels by quite some distance. So I think that'll need some renewed and very serious thinking. I cover it a little bit in the book.
Thank you. Larissa, you'll go. Larissa, yes, you're muted. Larissa?
Yes, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself there.
Right, okay.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Stephen. It's been really, really interesting. I've got a couple of questions for you. Considering 3 points. One is Boris Johnson's role in the situation in Northern Ireland now, his very poor deal, or very, or the lies he told, and basically, his impact on this. Then thinking about the fact that there are several grace periods still running at the moment, so the end of those will make the impact of Brexit much more obvious. And thirdly, the possibility of a third wave in the pandemic and possibly another lockdown. And these things seem very unconnected just now, but if these three things could well have a huge impact on the mood of the people in the country, could that lead to a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister? And if so, could that have an impact on a potential independence referendum, because there would be hope of a positive change in Westminster?
Can I interrupt quickly? Because I saw
Yes.
a thing flash across my screen while we were talking, saying that there'd been an agreement to postpone the setting up of border posts in Northern Ireland for 2 years.
Ah,
Okay.
Oh my God.
Whether
So
that is
I've
happened,
put that in the wrong graph.
it just crossed the screen earlier on while we were talking here. So has something happened? Anyway, carry on. That's just relevant to this issue in Northern Ireland.
it
Potentially.
is. The first thing I'll say, Larissa, and I hope I'm wrong, I dearly hope I'm wrong, but there's a mistake that people like us who are pro-European, who find the current government with its anti-Europeanism really unpleasant. But I think sometimes we have to remember, that certainly in England, Boris Johnson remains popular. His opinion poll levels are high. It's very difficult to see any alternative emerging. You know, the Lib Dems are down, I think, 10 seats, 4 of those in Scotland. Labour aren't making much in the way of progress, and have decided through their focus group works, I understand it, that pursuing a pro-European agenda is not for them. You know, so you've got Ed Davies saying rejoin the EU is for the birds, Keir Starmer saying something very, very similar, we're not joining the EU. So it seems off the table. People hold on to their EU referendum vote, and we've seen the dip in livelihoods, we've seen the disasters at Dover, we've seen the price of food and drink go up, but it's not having an impact. It's just not having an impact.
Not yet.
So I think sometimes we need to be realistic that this is not going to solve itself, certainly at a UK level in the short term. I don't think it is. I hope I'm wrong. I really do. I hope I'm wrong. On Northern Ireland, what's happened in Northern Ireland's abhorrent, and I can remember from the 2017 to 29 Parliament that was so decisive, we badly missed in Parliament. I was doing a lot of work cross-party at the time, and I worked in part of the team on the Ben and Burr Act to stop a no-deal Brexit, and I worked quite closely with Oliver Letwin on that as well. We were, in terms of Northern Ireland, nobody was talking about it. I can remember raising it and being told I was scaremongering, and others would raise it and be told they were scaremongering. There was no concept. Part of the problem was the minority Conservative government relied on the DUP, and so the DUP was highly influential, but what was hardly cross-community in terms of raising its concerns, and was a Brexiteer party, the only Brexiteer party there. Sylvia Herman was one person and an independent MP. So we lacked the voices, and I am not going to make a comment on Northern Irish politics. It is not my place, but I will merely make the observation that during that time, Sinn Féin didn't take their seats, and therefore you didn't have representation of their electorate. The UUP and SDLP had both lost their parliamentarians, and therefore you did not have that. So you had a lack of diversity of voices when it came to Northern Ireland. And again, it's not for me to judge how the people in Northern Ireland cast their votes. That's their business, not mine. But I think having that lack of diversity in voices from Northern Ireland was very, very damaging at that time, and not having those voices. And we see the consequences now, that you have, that Boris Johnson, I'm afraid to say, you also see the consequences. If you're in politics, your words matter. If you tell the unionist community in Northern Ireland that there is no way, Jose, that there'll be a border in the Irish Sea, no way, no way, no way, and then all of a sudden there's a border in the Irish Sea, you can't then blame the unionist community for being a bit angry about that. At the same time, we know that Brexit's making everybody poorer. I saw David Davis stand up in the Commons recently and talk about the Scottish Government should be more open. Well, David Davis was when we had to get, Keir Starmer and I put together a motion that forced David Davis to show the Brexit impact assessments.
Yeah.
But we were only allowed to be shown them if we went in at a set time for just 1 hour, we surrendered our phones, and we had a civil servant looking over our shoulders. Now, I sat in the Foreign Affairs Committee. When I was getting security briefings, very serious security briefings, I did not have that level of scrutiny and looking at what I was reading, because there was an element of trust that I wouldn't, there. So they were not open about it. And we know that Northern Ireland's one of the worst impacted areas. We know that the biggest driver of conflict is disenfranchisement and poverty. And these are all things that are going to be made worse in Northern Ireland. And I've been astonished by some of the opinion leaders I've seen in the Daily Telegraph, looking at Nigel Dodds and also amongst Conservative benches, blaming Remainers, blaming everybody for the violence in Northern Ireland, if they talk about it at all. And this is where you need a Prime Minister to step up, talk about it, and take the issue of Northern Ireland seriously, as you saw, to be fair, with people like John Major and Tony Blair in the 1990s. And Northern Ireland's an area of very, very significant concern.
Yeah.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Larissa.
Bill, I think this is probably going to be the last one because we're coming up to 8:30. We can't go because I'm sure Stephen's got to go back and make sure those children are ready fast asleep. So, Bill, it's your turn, and then
I'll keep it short. Stephen, you've partly answered my question already, I guess. It's about the resourcing that is appropriate for, or would be appropriate for an independent Scottish country, and in terms of what it needs to do. I mean, it's well rehearsed that Ireland punches above its weight. Indeed, that's the subject of our next webinar. But to what, how you've seen it from both sides of the North Sea. How much work does Scottish government have to do in order to get ready for that scenario? Are we talking about something that can be put together? I mean, obviously there'll be stuff that will take decades in terms of forming relationships, but how quickly could that be ramped up?
So firstly, and again, I challenge the Scottish Government to go a little bit further. So the first thing I'm going to say before I set out the challenges for them is that, remember, the Scottish Government does not have a budget for foreign policy, and it does not have the wherewithal. Also, the FCO is notoriously centralised. And I spoke to a number of British ambassadors who I met over the years in embassies, and they weren't even doing things. And sometimes the British ambassadors would be desperate to do things like reach out to the Scottish diaspora, use the Scottish brand, for broader UK policy interests. In fact, David Campbell Bannerman, who John will know, who is a conservative, rabid Brexiteer, even said to me he wished that the UK had used the Scottish brand to reach into the US diaspora in the different states when they were trying to get a trade deal with the US, and the Foreign Office didn't. Now, from a Scottish Government perspective, they've got a significant job, because the Irish, of course, who are described as, the Irish for the first time in their history now have more clout in Brussels and Washington, DC than the UK does. And we saw that through the Brexit process. For the first time in their history, that didn't come from nowhere. That's come from almost a century of diplomatic wherewithal. But also, to be fair, I think in fairness to Simon Coveney, who's been Irish Foreign Minister for a few years, he has handled things with a deft touch, with an understanding touch, and tried to act very sensitively to British interests as well, which has gone down in Washington, and just never been out of London, Brussels, DC, Berlin, Paris. He's worked really hard on that. Now, there are some positives from a Scottish perspective. One thing the Scottish Government have started doing is there have been a number of former diplomats who have left the UK government over Brexit. I think over Brexit, these are diplomats, they wouldn't express a view, but a lot of them feel more comfortable in the Scottish Government, and you've seen some diplomatic appointments. So the head of the External Affairs Service at the moment is a guy called Scott Whiteman, and he was a former British ambassador in Seoul and British High Commissioner in Singapore, so a very senior member of the FCO. And he's now left the FCO, gone to the Scottish Government. There's the head of the Scottish Government office in Dublin is somebody called John Webster, who came from the British Embassy in Dublin. And you've got Mike Nielsen, who Joel know, who's in Brussels, who's got a long experience in UPCREP and in the European institutions. Now, being in an economic development agency is a really important job at SDI or Scottish Enterprise, but it's not the same as being a diplomat. They're different jobs. And it's really interesting to see these former British diplomats who have joined the Scottish service because they bring a whole different range of skills. And I remember, for example, spending time with Mike in Brussels, Mike Nielsen in Brussels, but also John Webster in Dublin. So I used to go to the Irish Parliament just to brief them. And if you went with John, who was just going, you'd have done this for any UK or Scottish parliamentarian, John just knew everybody. He was able to say, this is an issue that's important to that parliamentarian, that person you might want to speak to because they're interested in, I don't know, higher education, they're interested in fisheries. So you see that skill set, and the Scottish Government are starting to build that up, but it's a very low level, and you don't have that same network of embassy, embassy. You don't have that diplomatic status that, say, the Flemish, the Faroese, the Quebecers might have. So you're a bit hobbled in what you can do, but my argument would be you need to invest in it. You need to upskill in Brussels. And actually, the other thing that we need to get used to in Scotland is, do you know when ministers get on planes and travel places? That is a good thing, right? If you spend money on flights and a hotel for the night in Brussels, that's okay. I feel quite, so it's and I've noticed in recent years in politics in Scotland across the piece that we spend so much time scrutinizing. I can remember ministers getting a really hard time for how much were your flights to Brussels? And it's kind of like, rather than what did you do when you were in Brussels, which should be the question. Scrutiny is fine. Scrutiny is fine, but I think the scrutiny should be, is it a good use of your time? And if a minister can come back and go, yes, I did X, Y, and Z, that's fine, rather than you shouldn't be traveling, which is often the political. So I think we need to change our political culture that traveling and engaging with our partners is okay.
I think
Thanks,
you made such a good point there, Stephen, because I was always appalled how few applicants we ever had for posts in Scotland House. There were 4, when we first set it up, there were just 4 permanent posts, and filling those from the whole of the Scottish office in Edinburgh was incredibly difficult. I mean, so I think they need the equivalent of what Maggie set up when she was trying to upskill the whole UK civil service to be effective in Brussels, the European fast stream. They need to do that again. They need to educate people to be quadrilingual. You can't just go to Brussels. Well, actually, it's a bit easier just speaking English now because of all the new member states, but you don't get that nitty-gritty niceness that you can if you speak the languages.
Yeah.
We'll need that in the future for sure.
Yeah, it puts an interesting spin on the Scottish European Educational Trust, which was a spin-off from European movements many years ago, of course. And I think you had an involvement there, Stephen, if my sources are correct.
Yes, yeah.
That was the lovely daughter of my professor, one of my lecturers at St Andrews, who ran that. What was her name? Anyway, yes, and they used to those very good quizzes in the Scottish Parliament.
Wasn't Nancy Norman, was it?
No, no. Well,
Barbara MacLeod?
Barbara, yeah.
Barbara MacLeod. Her father was a lecturer at
Yeah.
St Andrews University. Yeah.
I had a coffee with her the other day, John.
Yeah, right. There she goes. Give her my regards.
She's very well.
Love to see her again. Anyway, thank Stephen. Another thing, use old MEPs who know their way around Brussels a bit. You know, not old codgers like me, but there are a lot of others who are a lot younger and brighter, more sprightly, but they know people. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, but you know heaps of people, John, and you've got that depth of experience. I think you're in a competent contact.
We're available. Anyway, Stephen, I just wanted to say thank you so much.
No, thank you.
It's been a fascinating evening. Really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And a nice small group here, but it is recorded, and I hope it's okay with you if it is now dispersed around the European movement in all over Scotland and elsewhere. Because I think it would be very illuminating for them as well. And thank you very much. And we hope to get you back. I'm going to see your chief executive a few days after May the 6th. So we'll see where we are at that point. That's the EU and me thing. So we'll see. I'll find out what it's all about.
Do, and please go and have a look at them. They've done some really exciting stuff with musicians who are being stopped going overseas. With Erasmus, people are being stopped doing Erasmus and are moving on to some businesses. So please go and have a look, and I hope it complements the work that you're doing as well.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Go back to those children, make sure they're fast asleep. Or on
nice to see you all.
What they're meant to do. And good night to Simon Barrow. I'd like to say good night to you and to all our members. Thank you very much for looking in.
Thanks very much.